A merchant in Alexandria, Egypt, in 1271 is weighing a small leather pouch of black peppercorns, and that pouch is worth more than the horse standing outside his door. That is not a quirk of one unusual afternoon. For nearly 2,000 years, a single spice, one that grows on a vine, weighs almost nothing and tastes like the back of a pantry shelf, dictated which empires rose, which cities died, and which oceans were charted for the very first time. Every map you've ever seen of the world, every shipping lane, every colonial border, the original logic beneath all of it traces back to the same desperate, burning question. Where does the pepper come from, and how do we cut out the middleman? Let's start with the numbers because they stop you cold. In ancient Rome, specifically in the year 408 AD, the Visigoth king Alaric laid siege to the city of Rome and demanded a ransom to leave. Among the items on his list, 5,000 pounds of gold, 30,000 pounds of silver, and 3,000 pounds of black pepper, not as an afterthought, not as a symbolic flourish, as a serious, non-negotiable line item in a war settlement. The Roman Senate paid it. Every grain of that pepper had traveled overland from the Malabar coast of southwestern India, modern-day Kerala, passing through dozens of hands, each one taking a cut, before arriving in Rome already worth its weight in precious metal. Roman cookbook writer Apicius, whose recipes survive to this day, called for pepper in nearly 80% of his dishes. Rome's wealthiest citizens stored pepper in locked vaults alongside coins. When the city of Alaric was done and the ransom was hauled away, what the Romans grieved almost as much as the gold was the spice. And that grief, that dependence, is the exact thread that would eventually pull the entire medieval world tight. That dependence didn't ease when Rome fell, it calcified. By 1000 AD, the spice trade between Asia and Europe had consolidated into one brutally efficient choke point. The Arab and Venetian merchant networks controlling the overland Silk Road and the Red Sea corridor. Venice, a city of roughly 100,000 people sitting on a lagoon in northeastern Italy, was extracting so much profit from this monopoly that by 1300 AD, it was the wealthiest city-state in Europe, per capita richer than any rival. How wealthy? The Venetian Republic was funding construction of the Basilica di San Marco with money earned almost entirely from spice transit fees. The markup on pepper from its origin in Kerala to its street price in London or Paris was, by some merchant records of the 13th century, approximately 1,000%. A bag bought in Calicut for 1 unit of silver sold in Venice for 10, and sold again in Paris for nearly 100. Every transaction was perfectly legal. Every toll was somebody's livelihood. And every European king and merchant who bought pepper at the end of that chain knew, with burning clarity, that they were being taken. They just had absolutely no way around it. That resentment, that locked-out fury, is exactly what lit the fuse on the age of exploration. Here is where the story inverts. Portugal in the 1400s was a small, poor kingdom on the edge of the Atlantic, not a superpower, not an empire, barely a player. But Portuguese King João II had a strategist's obsession with one problem: bypassing Venice. In 1488, his explorer Bartolomeu Dias became the first European to round the southern tip of Africa, the Cape of Good Hope, proving a sea route to Asia was physically possible. 9 years later, in 1497, Vasco da Gama left Lisbon with 4 ships and 170 men. He sailed south around Africa, crossed the Indian Ocean, and arrived in Calicut, Kerala, the single largest pepper-producing port on Earth, in May 1498. The round trip took 2 years. When da Gama returned to Lisbon in 1499, his ships were loaded with pepper, cinnamon, and cloves bought directly at the source. The profit from that one voyage, bypassing every Arab toll, every Venetian middleman, every overland fee, was estimated at 3,000% return on investment. Portugal hadn't just found a trade route. It had found a way to surgically remove 60 middlemen and pocket every coin they'd been collecting for 3 centuries. What looked like exploration was, at its core, a supply chain disruption. And it worked so catastrophically well that it didn't just change Portugal. It made the entire medieval trade system obsolete in under a decade. Portugal's success didn't go unnoticed for long. Spain, watching their Iberian neighbor suddenly become fabulously rich, funded their own gamble in 1492. A Genoese sailor named Christopher Columbus, who believed he could reach Asia's spice ports by sailing west across the Atlantic instead of south around Africa. Columbus was wrong about the geography in almost every measurable way. He miscalculated the circumference of the Earth by roughly 25%, didn't account for the American continents existing at all, and died in 1506, still insisting he had reached the outskirts of Asia. But here is the staggering consequence. The miscalculation that was supposed to find pepper instead found two entire continents. And those continents contained resources: silver, gold, tobacco, cacao, potatoes, tomatoes, that would reshape European economies more profoundly than pepper ever had. The entire demographic, agricultural, and economic transformation of the modern world, what historians call the Columbian Exchange, was a navigational accident funded by pepper envy. Spain and Portugal were so desperate to cut Venice out of the spice trade that they accidentally mapped half the globe. Meanwhile, Venice, still sitting on its lagoon, still taxing overland routes that no one wanted anymore, lost 60% of its trade volume in less than 30 years. The city that pepper built was quietly bankrupted by the search for more pepper. Now go back to that merchant in Alexandria, 1271, weighing his pouch of peppercorns on a brass scale. Here is what that scene actually contains, if you know where to look. That single transaction, multiplied millions of times across centuries, generated so much frustrated, locked-out demand that it drove 5 separate European nations into shipbuilding arms races, funded voyages that charted the Atlantic, the Indian Ocean, and the Pacific, and set the coordinates for every colonial empire that followed. Historians estimate that between 1500 and 1800, the global spice trade moved the equivalent of over $500 billion in today's value across the world's oceans. The borders of modern Brazil exist because Portugal needed to protect its African sea route and drew a line at the 1494 Treaty of Tordesillas, a line negotiated, at its root, over access to pepper. The population of the Americas was decimated, tens of millions of people, because Columbus needed investors who wanted a cheaper path to spice markets. The transatlantic slave trade was partly powered by the labor demands of plantation crops that filled the trade vacuum left when pepper routes were disrupted. Not a single one of these events was planned. Not one explorer set out to reshape demography or draw continental borders. They were all, every one of them, chasing a small, wrinkled, dried berry that costs about $3 for a jar at the grocery store. The mundane thing sitting in your spice cabinet right now, the thing you shake over scrambled eggs without thinking, once made kings desperate, empires violent, and cartographers famous. It didn't just flavor food. It flavored the entire architecture of the modern world. Follow one fact a day, no fluff. And here's the question that doesn't have a clean answer yet. If pepper shaped the modern world this completely, what ordinary commodity sitting in your life right now is quietly doing the same thing?